My wife told me my touch made her feel pressured, and I believed her so completely that I started feeling guilty for things as small as brushing my hand against her back in our own kitchen. I thought backing off would make her feel safe again. Instead, it gave me the first clear look at a truth she had been hiding in plain sight. Her name is Elena. We'd been married 12 years by then. I was 41, she was 38, and for most of our marriage I would have described us as close in the ordinary ways that matter. Not dramatic. Not overly affectionate in public. But solid. Familiar. We had our small rituals. Morning coffee together when schedules allowed. A hand on the shoulder passing in the hallway. Her feet in my lap while we watched something neither of us cared much about. Me reaching for her waist while she cooked and her pretending to be annoyed about it for half a second before leaning back anyway. That was the version of us I still carried in my head when things started changing. I couldn't tell you exactly when the shift began. That's what made it so hard to fight. There wasn't one big moment. No obvious betrayal, no explosion, no confession, no dramatic before and after. It was more like Elena started pulling pieces of herself out of our marriage so slowly that by the time I really felt the emptiness, it had already become the new normal. First, she got more tired. Then she got more particular. Then even simple affection started landing wrong. At first I thought I was imagining it. I'd put my hand on her lower back while we were standing at the sink, and she'd subtly move forward. I'd kiss the side of her head while she was reading and she'd say she was trying to focus. I'd reach for her in bed and she'd let out this little breath, not annoyed exactly, but tense enough that I'd pull away before she had to say anything. Each moment by itself was nothing. That was the trap. Nothing big enough to justify feeling hurt. Nothing sharp enough to point to and say, there, that's the problem. Just a growing collection of tiny recoils that made me feel less like a husband and more like a man who kept getting too close to something he should already know not to touch. The first time Elena actually said it out loud, we were in the kitchen on a Tuesday night. I remember stupid details from that evening because that's what the mind does when something changes shape in front of you. The dishwasher was running. There was a half-cut lemon on the counter. I had one hand on her hip while I was reaching around her for a glass, something I had probably done 100 times in our marriage without either of us thinking about it. She stiffened immediately. I moved back and asked what was wrong. She hesitated for a second, then said she needed me to stop doing that. I asked what she meant. She said sometimes my touch made her feel pressured. Not angry. Not loud. Just careful. Measured. As if she had already rehearsed the sentence enough times in her head that she knew how to make it sound fair. I remember staring at her, waiting for the rest of it. Some clarification that would make it smaller. She was stressed. She had a headache. She meant tonight, not in general. But instead she dried her hands on a dish towel and said she felt like even casual affection lately came with expectation behind it. That word stayed with me. Expectation. I asked if she thought I was pressuring her. She said not on purpose. Then she said that was almost harder, because it made her feel guilty for reacting to it. I cannot fully explain what that does to a man who loves his wife. One minute you are confused and hurt. The next you are horrified at yourself for being the source of discomfort without even meaning to be. It rearranges the whole emotional map instantly. Your hurt gets shoved aside by guilt. Your confusion gets replaced by caution. You stop asking whether you're being rejected and start asking whether you've somehow become unsafe to the person you love most. That was exactly where I went. I apologized right there in the kitchen. Too quickly, probably. Too completely. Elena said she wasn't trying to attack me. She just needed more space, less physical pressure, less of that sense that every touch had a second meaning attached to it. She said she wanted to feel close to me again, but not if closeness felt loaded every time it happened. So I did what a man does when he thinks the survival of his marriage depends on becoming gentler, smaller, easier to live with. I backed off. I backed off so hard I practically disappeared. No more hand on her waist when she passed by. No more reaching for her thigh in the car. No more kissing the back of her neck while she folded laundry. No more touching her in bed unless she initiated something, which she never did. I stopped the little affectionate habits that had once been so normal I never even thought of them as habits. At first, I told myself this was temporary. A reset. Maybe Elena really did just need room to breathe. Maybe I had let loneliness turn every small touch into a silent request, and she had started feeling cornered by it. That was painful to hear, but not impossible. So I tried to be the mature one. The safe one. The understanding husband who listened when his wife told him what she needed. She noticed the difference within days. Not because she missed it. Because she relaxed. That was the first thing that cut deeper than I expected. There was a lightness in her once I stopped reaching for her. A physical ease. She moved around the house without that low-level brace I had started seeing in her shoulders. She seemed more comfortable, more unguarded, and I wanted to take that as a good sign. I really did. I wanted to believe that if I respected the boundary well enough, she would eventually meet me halfway again. Instead, the marriage got quieter. Not hostile. Not openly cold. Just eerily polite. Elena thanked me more. Smiled in passing. Asked about my day. Sent me grocery lists and calendar reminders and the occasional link to something for the house. We functioned well. Efficiently, even. From the outside, it probably looked like we were doing fine. Two adults handling life responsibly. Inside the marriage, I felt like I had been downgraded from husband to someone useful and non-intrusive. Weeks went by like that. I started second-guessing every instinct I had. If I missed her, I kept it to myself. If I wanted to say the distance felt worse now, I swallowed it. I told myself not to turn her honesty into another burden for her to carry. I told myself love sometimes means adjusting. I told myself space can heal things you can't force. But there is a difference between giving someone space and watching them use that space to drift farther away. I didn't understand that yet. What I did understand was that Elena no longer had to reject me because I had removed the need for rejection from our lives. And once that happened, something about her became easier. That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because ease is a strange thing to witness when you are the one disappearing to make room for it. A month after that kitchen conversation, we went to dinner with another couple we knew, Greg and his wife Tasha. Nothing special. Just one of those Friday night plans you keep because canceling would draw more attention than showing up. Elena spent the afternoon getting ready with a level of care I had not seen in a while. Nothing over the top. Just more attention to details. Hair done properly. Makeup finished before we left instead of in the car mirror. A blouse I liked that she hadn't worn in months. For 1 weak second, I actually felt hopeful. Then I watched her through the whole dinner. She was warm. Animated. Easy. Not with me specifically, but in general. She laughed faster. Touched Tasha's arm while reacting to a story. Leaned across the table when Greg was describing some disaster at work. There was nothing inappropriate in any of it. But seeing that version of her out in the world after weeks of being treated like my affection was something heavy and invasive, and it did something ugly inside me. It made me start asking the question I had been trying not to ask. Was the problem really touch? Or was the problem my touch? I hated myself for even thinking it. After dinner, on the drive home, Elena seemed lighter than she had in weeks. She even talked more than usual, replaying funny parts of the night. At a red light, I glanced over and said it was nice to see her in a good mood. She smiled and said it had been nice to get out for once. I almost asked whether getting out felt easier because I wasn't reaching for her anymore. I almost asked whether she missed anything about us at all. But the old fear came back immediately, that saying any of it would prove her point, that even now I was turning ordinary moments into pressure. So I said nothing. That became my pattern. Silence in places where I used to live honestly. And once I got quiet enough, I started noticing more. Elena's phone was suddenly always close by. Not in a cartoonish way. Just never casually abandoned the way it used to be. On the couch cushion beside her. On the bathroom counter while she got ready. Face down on the kitchen island. If she left the room without it and it buzzed, she'd come back for it faster than before, like some invisible thread had tugged. Again, none of that meant anything by itself. But the strange thing about backing off from someone is that it clears the fog in a different way. When you stop constantly trying to fix the closeness, you start seeing the shape of the distance. One Sunday afternoon, Elena was getting ready to meet a friend for coffee. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting an earring while I folded laundry on the bed. She looked good. Not just attractive. Awake. Present in herself. For months, she had moved around me like my attention was one more thing she had to manage. Standing there in front of that mirror, she looked like a woman inhabiting her own body comfortably again. Then her phone lit up on the dresser. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was too far away to see the message itself. But I saw her face when she picked it up. It changed. Not dramatically. Just a small private smile, the kind that happens before a person remembers they are not alone. Then she caught my reflection in the mirror. And it was gone. She tucked the phone into her purse and asked whether the blue cardigan looked better than the cream one. I told her the blue one looked nice. She nodded, grabbed her keys, and left. I sat there on the edge of the bed with one of my t-shirts half folded in my hands, staring at the empty doorway long after I heard her car back out of the driveway. Because for the first time since Elena told me my touch felt like pressure, I wasn't thinking about what I had done wrong anymore. I was thinking about what seemed to disappear only when it came from me. Once I saw that smile, I couldn't go back to not seeing it. It would have been easier if Elena had become openly cold. Easier if she had picked fights, slammed doors, or said something careless enough for me to point it later and call the beginning of the end. But that wasn't her style. She stayed controlled, thoughtful, measured. If anything, after I backed off, she got easier to live with. That was the problem. She seemed relieved. Not happier in our marriage. Just more comfortable inside it now that I had removed myself from the parts of it that used to matter most to me. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped trying to interpret what Elena felt and started paying attention to what she did. That alone changed everything. Before, I had been too busy monitoring myself. Was I coming on too strong? Was I making her uncomfortable without realizing it? Was every moment of disappointment on my face just another form of pressure? Once I stopped orbiting around my own guilt, I started noticing that Elena's moods weren't random at all. They followed patterns. She was flatter with me at home than ever. Not mean. Not sharp. Just smooth in a way that left no opening. She'd ask whether I wanted chicken or pasta for dinner in the same tone she used to ask whether I'd paid the water bill. She'd sit beside me on the couch with her legs tucked under her, phone in hand, present in body but nowhere else. We could go a whole evening with nothing technically wrong and still feel like two people waiting out weather in the same shelter. But then, at odd moments, something in her would flicker back on. A message. A plan. Somewhere she had to be. That was when the energy changed. One Thursday evening, she was getting ready for what she described as just drinks with 2 women from work. I remember that wording because she made it sound casual enough that noticing anything would make me seem ridiculous. Just drinks. Nothing special. But for something that wasn't special, she spent a long time getting ready. I was in the bedroom pretending to sort laundry while she stood at the mirror doing her makeup. Not the rushed version she usually did for errands or ordinary workdays. This was slower. More deliberate. She changed earrings twice. Swapped blouses. Sprayed perfume at her wrists and throat, then stepped back from the mirror and looked at herself from an angle like she cared how the whole picture landed. For a second, I forgot myself and said she looked really nice. She met my eyes in the mirror and thanked me. Then she went right back to checking her phone. That was what kept happening. I could still exist enough to hand her a compliment, open a door, carry groceries, pass the salt. But I no longer seemed to have access to whatever spark had started waking back up inside her. When she left, the house felt instantly heavier. Not because I missed her physically being there. Because I had just watched my wife put real effort into becoming visible again, and none of it felt connected to me. She came home a little after 10, cheeks flushed, moving quickly, still carrying some leftover brightness from wherever she had been. I was at the kitchen counter putting a glass in the dishwasher when she walked in. She said the place had been loud, one of the women talked too much, everybody stayed longer than expected. I nodded and asked whether she had fun. She said it was fine. Fine. Then she smiled at something on her phone while walking upstairs. I stood there in the kitchen staring at nothing, hearing her footsteps fade, and had the weirdest, clearest thought I'd had in weeks. Elena was not shut down. She was selective. That thought bothered me so much I almost said it out loud just to hear how cruel it sounded. The next suspicious moment came 2 days later, and it was smaller, which somehow made it worse. Saturday afternoon. Grocery bags on the counter. I was unloading produce while Elena stood near the sink answering a text. She had that same private half-smile on her face, the one that vanished whenever I got too close to seeing it. Then she caught herself, set the phone face down, and asked whether I had remembered to buy sparkling water. I said yes. She nodded and moved on like nothing had happened. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Because once or twice is a mood. A coincidence. A random moment. After a while, it becomes a pattern. And patterns are harder to talk yourself out of. I started noticing how fast she reached for her phone when it buzzed. How often she took it with her now, even for quick trips to the bathroom or laundry room. How she seemed more alert in the late afternoon, like she was moving towards something. I also noticed that she never volunteered details first anymore. If she was meeting someone, she named the safe part. Work friend. Coffee. Errand. Quick stop. But the specifics always felt thin, like labels placed over something larger. Then came Greg's birthday dinner. It was at a steakhouse downtown, just 6 of us, nothing fancy. Elena almost canceled in the morning because she said she was tired, But by 5:30 she had changed her mind and was suddenly moving through the house with that same focused energy I had started associating with every plan that didn't involve me. She wore a fitted black top I hadn't seen in months and spent extra time on her hair. At dinner, she sat across from me and beside Greg. I wish I could say something dramatic happened. It didn't. That was what made it so disturbing. Greg told a story about some disaster at his office, and Elena laughed, then touched his forearm for half a second while reacting. Totally normal on paper. Friendly. Human. The kind of thing nobody else at the table would remember 10 minutes later. But I remembered it because my body reacted before my mind did. Not because I thought she wanted Greg. I didn't. Because she looked natural doing something she had trained me to believe was now too loaded, too pressuring, too difficult. Later, when Tasha was showing us pictures from a weekend trip, Elena leaned in close beside her, shoulder touching shoulder, warm and easy and physically unguarded in a way I hadn't felt from her in months. Again, completely innocent. Again, probably nothing. But sitting across from her, I had to face a possibility I had been resisting. Maybe Elena's issue was never physical closeness itself. Maybe it was physical closeness from me. That thought settled into me like a stone. On the drive home, she was in a good mood. Relaxed. Talking about how good the food was, how Greg always exaggerated his stories, how Tasha had probably spent too much on that trip. I answered where I needed to, but mostly I listened. At a red light, she glanced over and asked if I was tired. I almost laughed at that. Tired wasn't the word. Hollow, maybe. Slow burning. Awake in the wrong places. I told her yeah, just a long week. She nodded and turned back toward the windshield, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the last month in my head, but now through a different lens. Elena had told me my touch made her feel pressured. I had taken that seriously. More seriously than I had taken my own hurt. I had cut myself down inside my own marriage trying to make her feel safe. And instead of using that space to reconnect, she had simply become more comfortable while I disappeared. By Monday, I had stopped wondering whether I was imagining the distance. The question had changed. Now I wanted to know who she never seemed pressured by. I didn't get a name yet. What I got was worse in some ways. That evening, Elena was in the shower when her phone lit up on the bathroom counter. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was just in our room looking for a charger when the screen flashed bright enough for me to catch a preview before it went dark. I only saw part of it. Still thinking about yesterday. No name. No context. Just that line. I stared at the black screen after it dimmed, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. Yesterday. Greg's dinner had been yesterday. My first thought was Greg, which felt insane almost instantly. Then my mind started cycling through every possibility at once. One of the women from work. Some friend. Some harmless conversation I was about to turn poisonous in my own head. But the wording didn't feel harmless. Not with everything else. Not after the smiles. The effort. The carefulness. The way she seemed to keep one part of herself lit somewhere beyond my reach. I stepped away from the counter before the shower stopped. When Elena came back into the bedroom, hair damp, robe tied, phone in hand, she looked completely normal. Calm. Unhurried. She checked the screen, typed something quickly, and set it down again. Then she looked at me and asked if I wanted to order Thai or just eat leftovers. Just like that. Like there weren't two separate lives happening inside the same room. I said leftovers were fine. She nodded and walked downstairs ahead of me. I followed a few seconds later, already knowing something had shifted for good. Because whatever truth had been hiding behind all her talk of pressure and space, it wasn't abstract anymore. It had started taking shape. I didn't ask Elena about the message. That was the first decision I made that felt stronger than panic. Up to that point, I had still been reacting. Watching. Flinching internally. Trying to sort suspicion from insecurity in real time while pretending none of it was changing me. But once I saw that preview on her phone, still thinking about yesterday, I understood something I should have understood sooner. If I brought it to her now, she would do what she had done with everything else. She would smooth it out. There would be context. A harmless explanation. A tone I had misread. A reason I was connecting dots that didn't belong together. And maybe some of it would even sound plausible enough to make me hate myself for doubting her. So I stayed quiet. And once I stayed quiet, I started seeing more. Not because Elena got sloppy. She actually became more careful. But there's something that happens when you stop trying to fix a marriage and start observing it instead. You notice rhythms. Small absences. Repeated choices. The architecture underneath the explanations. Elena had patterns. Her energy changed in the late afternoon. That was the first one. If we were together around 4 or 5, I could almost feel a shift in her. She became more alert. More present in her own body. Not necessarily friendlier to me, but less dull, less flat. Like some internal current had started moving. She checked her phone more often during those hours too. Not obsessively. Just enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't stop. There were also certain nights she cared more about how she looked, and those nights no longer matched the importance of the plans she described. Coffee with a friend? Full attention to hair and makeup. A quick stop out. Changed earrings twice. Nothing special after work? New blouse, perfume, a longer look in the mirror than I'd gotten used to seeing at home. That contrast got under my skin worse than anything obvious could have. Because Elena had made me feel for months like my affection carried too much weight, too much expectation, too much pressure. Yet here she was moving through parts of her life with ease, care, and a kind of quiet anticipation she had stopped bringing anywhere near me. By Wednesday, I had started doing something I wasn't proud of. Not snooping exactly. Not at first. Just paying attention to timing. How long she stayed gone. How quickly she replied to messages when she was with me versus when she was out. Whether her explanations came before or after I asked. Whether stories stayed consistent from one version to the next. I found the first real crack that Friday. Elena told me she was meeting a woman from work named Dana for an early drink after office hours. She said Dana had been going through some mess with her boyfriend and needed to vent. Fine. Normal. Boring enough that doubting it made me feel cheap. She left around 5:30 wearing a soft gray sweater, dark jeans, and boots. Nothing flashy. But she had taken time getting ready. At around 7:15, I was in the kitchen when my phone buzzed. It was Greg, asking if I wanted to join him for a beer the next day to watch part of the game. I answered, and while we texted, I casually asked whether he and Tasha had any weekend plans. He said Tasha was meeting Elena and a couple of other women for brunch Sunday, but otherwise no. That shouldn't have mattered. Except Elena had told me 2 days earlier that she and Dana were already doing brunch Sunday, which was why Friday's drink mattered more. A tiny inconsistency. That was all. But tiny inconsistencies are how truth starts breathing. When Elena got home that night, she was in a good mood. Not glowing exactly, but lighter. Looser in the shoulders. She dropped her purse by the entry table and kicked off her boots with an absent little sigh that sounded satisfied, not drained. I asked how Dana was doing. Elena paused just long enough for me to notice. Then she said not great. Same relationship nonsense, different day. I asked where they went. She named a wine bar downtown. I nodded and went back to wiping the counter. A few minutes later, while she was upstairs changing, I stood there replaying the conversation and felt something mean and clear slide into place. If Dana was the truth, Elena would not have needed that pause. The next morning I did something I had resisted for weeks. I looked at the joint credit card account. I didn't know what I expected. A hotel room? Flowers? Something cinematic and obvious enough to free me from ambiguity. Instead I found something worse because it was more believable. The wine bar charge from the night before was there. So was a second charge from the same place 10 days earlier. Elena had never mentioned going there before. Still, that alone proved nothing. What bothered me was the size of the charge. Too high for 2 glasses of wine and some sympathy conversation. More like drinks and food for 2 people who stayed a while. Maybe even 3. Enough that I sat there staring at the number longer than I should have, trying to decide whether I was becoming the kind of man who builds a case out of receipts because he's too weak to ask direct questions. But direct questions were exactly what had gotten me nowhere. That Sunday, Elena went to brunch. She was casual about it. Blue cardigan, hair half pinned back, small gold hoops. The kind of outfit that says effortless while still being chosen. Before leaving, she stood in the hallway mirror checking lipstick with the concentration of someone heading somewhere she expected to be seen. I stayed on the couch, acting half interested in a game. She asked if I needed anything while she was out. I said no. Then she picked up her phone, looked at the screen, and smiled. Not broadly. Not stupidly. Just that same quick, private smile that never seemed meant for me anymore. After she left, I sat there for maybe 5 minutes before doing something I hated myself for even considering. I texted Tasha. I kept it light. Asked whether brunch was still on or if Greg had mixed up the plans. Tasha answered almost right away. She said Elena had cancelled that morning. Said something about needing to help Dana with a work thing instead. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. That was the moment my doubt stopped feeling theoretical. Because now I had something solid. Small, but solid. Elena had let me believe she was meeting Tasha and the others. Tasha believed Elena was helping Dana. And somewhere inside those two versions was the part Elena had not wanted either of us to have. When Elena came home, she brought pastries. That nearly broke me more than a lie. Not because of the pastries themselves. Because it was such a normal wife thing to do. Such an easy little act of domestic thoughtfulness. She came in smiling faintly, set the box on the counter, and said the bakery near the brunch place had my favorite kind, so she grabbed a couple. For one ugly second I wanted to take the box and throw it in the trash. Instead I thanked her. Then I asked how Tasha was doing. Elena's face didn't change much. That was what made it chilling. She just said Tasha had been in a good mood, talking a lot as usual. I nodded once. Then I asked whether Dana had gotten her work issues sorted out too. That got me. Not because Elena panicked. She didn't. She just went very still. Only for a second. But in that second I knew I had hit the edge of whatever she was managing. Then she let out a small breath and said Dana had called during brunch, so she stepped away for a bit to help her with something. It was a smooth answer. Quick. Flexible. Good enough that another version of me might have accepted it just because I was tired. But I had seen the pause. And once you start seeing those pauses, you realize how many marriages are held together by the space between one question and one answer. After that, I stopped looking for one dramatic reveal. I started building a picture. Elena's phone never left her hand for long now. When she showered, it stayed on the bathroom counter. When she cooked, it was angled on the far edge of the island face down. At night, she used to leave it on her dresser. Now it came to bed with her and disappeared under her pillow or inside the drawer of her nightstand. One Monday evening, I walked into the laundry room looking for detergent and heard her laughing softly in the garage. That by itself sounds ridiculous, I know. But Elena almost never took calls in the garage. If someone from work called, she answered wherever she was. If it was family, same thing. Yet there she was behind the door to the garage, voice lower than usual, laughing in that warm, unforced way I hadn't heard directed at me in months. The second she came back in and saw me, she said it was just her cousin Marissa asking about Thanksgiving plans. Maybe it was, but by then every explanation she gave me came with a shadow version underneath it, and I had stopped being able to tell whether I was losing my mind or finally using it. The name came 2 nights later. Elena had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket over her legs and the TV still running low. Her phone was on the armrest beside her. I wasn't trying to look at it. I really wasn't. I got up to turn off the lamp, and the screen lit with a notification before I could look away. I saw the name because it was impossible not to. Nate. Just that. And under it, only the first few words before the preview disappeared. Wish I could have. That was all I got. No more. But it was enough. Enough to put a shape where the fog had been. Enough to make every late smile, every protected screen, every careful explanation suddenly feel less like my imagination and more like a trail. I stood there in the dim light of the living room, looking at my sleeping wife and feeling something much worse than anger rise in me. Humiliation. Because while I had been shrinking myself to become less pressuring, less present, less wanting, Elena had been building a private emotional life sturdy enough to need names, cover stories, and separate versions of the truth. I turned off the lamp and walked into the kitchen before she woke up, because I didn't trust my face not to show everything. Standing there in the dark, one hand on the counter, I realized I wasn't just afraid of what I'd find. I was afraid I already understood enough to know what it meant. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped wondering whether Elena was hiding something. I started wondering how long she'd been more comfortable being touched by absence than by me. I didn't confront Elena when I saw Nate's name. That probably sounds strange after everything. But by then I understood something that had taken me months to learn. The first truth you get from a person who has been managing your reality is almost never the whole truth. It is only the version they think you can survive while they still keep control. So I waited. Not forever. Just long enough to stop walking into explanations before the facts did. Once I had a name, the whole marriage started feeling narrower. More directed. Elena's habits no longer seemed random. They seemed organized around protecting one channel of her life from another. There was the version of her that moved through our house with careful neutrality, accepting my distance, thanking me for groceries, asking what I wanted for dinner. Then there was the version that lived in glances at her phone, In private smiles, in the slight lift in her voice when she left for coffee or a quick stop or just an hour out. Nate gave that second version a center. For the next few days, I stayed quiet and watched. Tuesday evening, Elena told me she had to stay late because a client issue had exploded at work. She came home just after 9, not flustered, not irritated, not drained in the way real work stress used to leave her. She looked composed. Almost settled. She set her bag down, slipped off her shoes, and went straight to the kitchen for water. I asked if the issue got resolved. She said mostly. Then her phone buzzed in her bag. She moved toward it so quickly that the answer reached me before the excuse did. That was how it was now. Her body always knew first. Wednesday, she said she was grabbing lunch with Dana. That one almost made me laugh. By then, Dana had become less a person and more a tarp she kept throwing over whatever she didn't want me to see. I just nodded and told her I hoped she had a good time. She came back an hour and a half later with lipstick touched up and a brightness in her face that had nothing to do with sandwiches and work gossip. Thursday night, Greg texted me asking whether Elena had enjoyed seeing that old friend again. I stared at the message for a full 10 seconds before answering. I asked what old friend. Greg said he thought Elena had mentioned it to me already. He and Tasha had run into her downtown during lunch, and she was with some guy from her college days or early work years. Greg couldn't remember which. Tall guy. Dark jacket. Beard. Greg said they looked deep in conversation and he hadn't wanted to interrupt for long. I thanked him and put the phone face down on the table. Then I sat there in silence while something inside me went from suspicion to shape. Because Elena had not told me she saw an old friend. She had told me she was with Dana. That was the first piece that wasn't just suggestive. It was a lie that required a replacement person. When Elena got home, she was carrying takeout for both of us. Again, that nearly made it worse. She smiled, held up the bag, and said she'd picked up Thai because she didn't feel like cooking. She looked so normal standing there in the doorway that for 1 weak second I almost wanted to stay in the lie with her. Eat dinner. Watch something pointless. Keep pretending I still lived inside a marriage instead of beside a performance. Instead, I asked how Dana was doing. Elena blinked once, then said busy. I asked whether Dana had enjoyed lunch. A second of stillness. Then she said yes. Why? I looked at her for a long moment and realized I was done collecting. I said Greg and Tasha had seen her downtown. She didn't move. I told her they said she wasn't with Dana. She set the takeout bag on the counter very carefully, like any sudden movement might make the room crack. Then she asked what exactly Greg said. That question told me everything. Not they're mistaken. Not you're twisting this. Not even what are you implying. Just a quiet attempt to measure the damage. I said he saw her with a man. Her face changed then, not into panic exactly, but into something more revealing, calculation failing in real time. She sat down at the kitchen table without being asked. I stayed standing. I asked if the man was Nate. She looked up at me like I had stepped into a room she had worked very hard to keep locked. Then she asked how I knew that name. I said it didn't matter. What mattered was whether I was right. She took a breath and pressed both hands flat against the table. I remember staring at her fingers because I couldn't bear looking at her face while she decided what version of my life to hand back to me. Then she nodded once. Just once. That was the reveal. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a single movement of her head in our kitchen under ordinary light, with takeout cooling on the counter and the refrigerator humming behind us. And somehow that made it hurt even more. Because betrayal never really arrives with music behind it. It shows up in ordinary rooms and ruins them forever. I asked who he was. She said they had known each other years ago, before me, and had reconnected recently after running into each other through mutual people. She said it started as talking. Catching up. Nothing serious at first. Nothing serious. I almost stopped her there. Instead I asked the question I had needed answered from the beginning. I asked whether my touch ever actually made her feel pressured. Not generally. Not in some abstract discussion about marriage and space and emotional needs. I asked whether she truly felt it with me, or whether she needed a way to push me back without telling me the real reason. Elena looked down. That was worse than any denial. After a long silence, she said it had felt complicated. I asked what that meant. She said by the time she told me that, she was already pulling away inside and didn't know how to explain it without hurting me. I actually laughed then, once, and it sounded ugly even to me. Because hurting me was exactly what she had done. She had just chosen a version that made me do part of it to myself. That was the deepest cut in all of it. Not Nate. Not lunch. Not the messages. It was the way she had turned my affection into something shameful so she could create distance without naming the real source of it. While I was shrinking, apologizing, removing myself piece by piece to make her feel safe, she was building warmth somewhere else. I asked if it had become physical. She took too long to answer. Then she said yes. Quietly. Like the volume could spare us both. I nodded because I didn't trust myself to do anything else. She started crying then. Real crying. Not controlled. She said she hadn't planned for any of it. She said she had felt disconnected for a long time. She said when I kept reaching for her, it made everything feel heavier because she already knew she wasn't where she was supposed to be anymore. That almost sounded honest, and I think that was why it hurt so much. There was probably truth in it. Just not the kind that excused anything. I told her the problem wasn't only that she had gone somewhere else emotionally and physically. It was that she let me spend months believing my love had become a burden by nature, when really it had become a burden because she was giving that part of herself to someone else. She tried to say my name. Tried to stand up. Tried to touch my arm. I stepped back. And for the first time since that sentence in the kitchen months earlier, I didn't care whether the distance I created made her uncomfortable. I told her I was done talking for the night. I said she could sleep in the guest room, and in the morning we could discuss practical things if she wanted, but I was finished listening to her turn betrayal into confusion. She cried harder at that. Asked me not to make a decision while I was angry. The truth was, I wasn't angry in the way she meant. Anger is hot. This was colder than that. This was clarity. She slept in the guest room. I stayed awake most of the night in our bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the last few months with a new kind of cruelty. Every time I had apologized. Every time I had pulled my hand back. Every time I had convinced myself I needed to be less loving, less visible, less wanting. By morning, the grief felt cleaner. Still awful. Still raw. But cleaner. Because I finally knew I had not imagined the shift. I had not been too needy, too touchy, too emotionally heavy for noticing that my own marriage had gone hollow. Elena had simply made my affection carry the blame for a withdrawal that already had another destination. Looking back, I can accept that people fall out of love in messy, cowardly ways. I can even accept that desire changes. What I can't forgive is being taught to feel ashamed of my tenderness just because she no longer wanted it from me. That kind of betrayal lasts longer than the affair itself.